Sorry for my bad handwriting. We'll start with the introduction of India as Bharat. So, author J. Sai Deepak starts the introduction by telling us about his engineering days and how he got into engineering, as engineering and medical were thought to be the safe job options during the 1990s. He wanted to initially go into aerospace engineering, but he settled for mechanical engineering. But during his seventh semester, he decided to think about other career options, in particular, two career options, that being law and the civil services. But he eventually decided to go ahead and do law. And the reason why this introspection came about was because of two main reasons. One, by his visits to various writings of people like Swami Vivekananda and of Ramakrishnan Mutt, and along with that, his realization of how post 2004 specific Indic identities and specific Indic individuals were being targeted, and they were being subjugated. And due to this realization, he also decided to delve into the field of law. And also, on a protection of civilization front, he particularly tells us that rather than submerging a particular sub identity, Bharat has always talked about protection of every sub identity which stems from its collective conscience, in the spirit of federalism, which is to say that despite your sub identity, whatever sub identity you have, each of it can flourish together with the main identity. It is not necessary for us to subvert the sub identity to, let's say, achieve some goal, as it would diminish the whole purpose. That being said, he then talks about his journey of law, how he joined IIT Kharagpur, which was a 3-year LLB course specifically pertaining to technical graduate students, and then few landmark cases that he dealt with, which was the trademark case of Tata Sons Limited against Greenpeace International, the Shreya Singhal versus Union of India case, and thereafter the HRCE petition, which was related to the state control of temples, in particularly that of Tamil Nadu, Pondicherry and other such states, and to free those particular states and the temple therein from the state control. And then the Sabrimala case, in which he fought, in which he could not, he was not his concern was not the fact that people were calling his arguments patriarchal, but his simple concern was that people were deeming his arguments or the protection of the Sabrimala temple as being archaic, being orthodox, being traditional in a negative sense, and being against modernity. To which he argues that a temple is made for the veneration of a deity, or let's say a god, and that has to happen in a certain way, and that protection has to happen in a certain way, and that deity has his own individual rights. So this modernity versus traditional outlook through the Sabrimala case forced him to look into a lot of literature. Furthermore, the Padmasambhava Swami temple case, which was again about state taking forceful control of the princely state of Travancore's right and the chief priest of the temple. And in this particular case, J. Sai Deepak won the case, and the Supreme Court ordered the restoration of the temple to the Travancore royal family. Subsequently, how in August to December 2019, three landmark developments in the form of abrogation of Article 370, the landmark Ayodhya judgment of the Ram Janmabhoomi, and thirdly, the CEA, which was made for the protection of the persecution of minority communities coming from the majority Muslim countries, all of them were talked about. Then he talks about how he was ridiculed for calling India Bharat, and somehow this name was thought to be in some way extremely wrong, even though, and non-constitutional, even though people have forgotten the fact that Article 1 itself states that India, that is Bharat, in its heading, which is Article 1 of the Constitution of India. And that is where all of these things become important. After that, this colonial construct is talked about, which is to say, uh, how J. Sai Deepak began talking about the colonial construct of certain things and writing a few pieces for First Post and The Open, capturing his view in this particular issue. And thereafter, he talks about the role of constitution, and the role of constitution is not to deflate the civilization of the whole. The role of the constitution is to be read and understood in the civilizational context and the historical context from which it has come about. And the constitution must be alive to the needs of the people, and it has to serve its intended purpose. Otherwise, it simply becomes a means to an end, which is to the detriment of the civilization of the, as a whole. Thereafter, he talks about various ideological ideological divides, which is to say, after reading a lot of literature which is pertaining to the works of various main authors, he realized the fact that most of the authors unduly accepted the European or the Western normative framework as opposed to the Indic framework, and few people who challenged this particular order, very few individuals, were not brought into the limelight, and these stereotypes were further propagated. Furthermore, even two different sets of opinion in the name of Indic reformation were in the detriment of Indic reformation. Firstly, being the fact that Bharat as an idea never existed, and secondly, being the fact that Bharat is an all encompassing concept that has to be reformed and it's innate open to new ideas. And due to this forceful reformation, the root of the civilization is being lost. So, both these ideas are actually working to the detriment of Bharat. Thereafter, he talks about how economics cannot be separated from all of this, because the fact that there is an economic prosperity, and if we take it from the West, then the individuals would feel that that is the only possible way or the framework of development, which is not the case. Our indigenous civilization and a glory on the same would help us realize that this economic prosperity can also come about through other means, like balancing nature with the development purposes and the various Indic needs. And thereafter, he talks about how there is an unwritten code that exists, which is to say that you cannot cross a certain threshold when you are questioning the well established Western framework. You have to keep in mind that, and this unwritten code is something that J. Sai Deepak is trying to challenge. The reason being that if we are in constant shackles of a colonial mindset, Bharat cannot be called as a Vishwaguru, which means a teacher or guide to the world, and it cannot be proud on its Indic civilization, which it had stood for eons and centuries before. That being said, his search brought him to a twofold reasons and what he seeks to do. Firstly, he wanted to understand the and demonstrate the global presence of the colonial experiences, considering that a lot of countries have had this Western imperialism, and thus he wanted to demonstrate the scale of the European colonialism. And secondly, he wanted the legitimacy of this particular literature for the Indic civilization of Bharat, because Bharat and the current views that exist seek legitimacy not from its own country, but from the views and legitimacy of the other individuals and from the world at large. And this required this the understanding of the consciousness. So both of these things got together hand in hand. That being said, a non Eurocentric view was the focus of the author in the examination of the books. The goals and objectives of the author were twofold. Firstly, to understand the Indic civilization by and large, and secondly, to extend that application to his core competence, which is the legal field or the constitutional field. This journey further gained limelight when Dr. Indu Vishwanathan, while J. Sai Deepak was delivering a lecture in a webinar or a seminar, I think a webinar it was, where he was delivering this lecture. Dr. Indu Vishwanathan called his thought process decoloniality in action, and this brought him to various other scholars and led him to reading a lot of material. In particular, was the material of scholar, Latin American scholar Anibal Quijano, who was one of the first individuals who conceptualized coloniality, which is to say how coloniality or the European colonialism forced their own religious beliefs and racial superiority to all of the other world at large, and how they thought of themselves as the superior world order and the other people as inherently lower individuals, and this created all of these racial hierarchies, and this also created forceful constructs in the name of modernity and rationality, which we all use loosely nowadays, where anything not associated with these particular European colonizers were thought to be ancient, traditional, and backward. And furthermore, a lot of times these European people, when they invaded these countries, they thought that the history begins now of these individuals. They completely disregarded the history and the way of life of the individuals who were colonized before they were colonized. This led to a lot of destruction of their culture. Now, that being said, what is the goal of decoloniality? The goal of decoloniality is to reclaim the rich past and traditions of these culture which have been destroyed, and it is to restore the respect of these culture and traditions which have been subverted by the European colonizers. That being said, the goal of decoloniality is this. Now, the one of the things is that for every country, the decoloniality would differ according to their own needs. For instance, a country which has suffered only from European colonization, that country's decoloniality will be different as compared to a country which has, let's say, had multiple decolonial experiences from different entities. Then the author talks about double standards, which is to say that when these literatures of decoloniality are written in other countries, they are talked about and they are applauded and it is held to be a positive experience. But when these same decolonial movements start and are being talked about in India, they are termed as a xenophobic, illiberal, and against the constitutional merit, and do not have any historical basis, and so on and so forth. So this double standard is something that the author has talked about. Thereafter, the author started writing an Indic View column in the Daily Guardian, and after writing around 18 issues, he decided to write this book. After that, the author tells us what exactly this book is about. It would have three main sections. Firstly, coloniality, which would talk about the global experience. Then the civilization aspect, which would narrow it down to the Bharat-centric view. And thirdly, the constitution aspect, which I think would be the most important aspect, as it would also serve as a prequel to the other two books which are going to be coming about. That being said, the coloniality, or the section 1, would talked about how the colonial experience has impacted the nature, religion, language, knowledge, education, law of the colonized society, and to its detriment, and how the concept of nation states by and large was a construct of the Westphalian uh, idea. And also the limitations of this aspect is also talked about, as the literature that is being analyzed is a lot of it is Latin American in origin, which that means that the decoloniality experience of India would be different from that, because Latin American countries had a different experience with coloniality. India had, or Bharat had, a completely different experience with decoloniality. That being said, secondly, civilization aspect, which is to say the impact of Bharat specifically or of the coloniality from 1600 to in particular 1853 is talked about. This particular section 2, civilization, would also trace the origin of universal constructs such as toleration, secularism, and humanism to Christian political ideas and Christian political theology, and also the impact of Middle Eastern coloniality and Middle Eastern colonialism, which preceded the European colonialism of Bharat, would be dealt with, and the role of post colonialism would also be dealt with, in particular the fact as to how post colonialism in a way has entrenched the already existing preconceived notions of Bharat, and has strengthened in a way the colonial shackles that were forced down the Bharat's throat. And thirdly, the section 3, which is the constitution aspect, which would be covering the journey from 1858 to 1990, would start from the British Crown Act of the 1858, which was immediately after the War of Independence, to the Government of India Act of 1919, which can be called as the first British made constitution for India, and how they have negatively impacted the Indian or the Bharatiya experience. Thereafter, two sequels which are going to be coming about are also talked about, and the tentative time frame for that is the second sequel would be covering the period from 1920 to 1951, and also the First Amendment, which came under our first Prime Minister in 1951, and the second book and the third book, which would cover the period from 1952 to 1977, but this is just a tentative time frame as of now, according to the author. Now, the author feels that he has made this book or written this book just as a starting point, so that certain talks can happen about the decolonial perspective, and he feels that, and he hopes much more than that, it sparks an honest conversation not only among the specialists but even among the non-specialists about what Bharat and decoloniality is all about. And while writing this book, he has tried to cite as much literature as possible. He has tried to cite as much sources as possible, and he has only drawn inferences based on sufficient evidence and sufficient literature. And he then humbly states that it would be for the future generations to decide whether I have succeeded in my endeavor as an author for this particular book. And at his heart, he is a lifelong learner.